How are you guys doing? Today is Saturday, July 3rd, 2021. I'm James Sims out here in this quarantine, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to do an individual profile on Chris Jones. The elite defensive tackle for the Kansas City Chiefs turns 27 today, and of course, I'm going to go through all the accolades, achievements through his career from the moment that he's been on the big stage, just to give a sense of how good of a football player he is, considering how many defensive tackles play in the NFL, just to show how remarkable it is to be as good as Chris Jones is. So if you're not familiar with him, he's originally from Houston, Mississippi. He stands at about 6'6", 310 pounds. I mean, just thinking about the kind of player he is, he's very fast. He does play he plays with the speed of a defensive end, and he's incredibly strong as well. And the fact that he was a Pro Bowler the last couple of years as a defensive tackle, and he was able to win a Super Bowl, should just show you what he was able to do. So out of Houston, Mississippi, he would eventually go play at Mississippi State with Dan Mullen at the time. He would play his very first season in 2013. In his freshman season, he would finish with about 32 tackles and 3 sacks, playing all 13 of the games that he would play. In a season where Mississippi State would finish with a 7-6 record, they would eventually end up beating Rice in the Liberty Bowl, to give a sense of how that season went. Following that first season, Chris Davis would come back for his second year in Mississippi State. In his sophomore year in 2014, he would play 12 games in a season where Mississippi State would finish with a 10-3 record, the best record that he had at Mississippi State. They would go on to lose to Georgia Tech in the Orange Bowl, as they finished as one of the top teams in the nation. Chris Jones would finish with 26 total tackles on the season, 6 less than the previous season. He had 3 sacks, which is just as many. And following that season, he would come back to Mississippi State for his junior year, playing all 13 games he would play. In a season where Mississippi State would finish with a 9-4 record, as they ended up their season by beating NC State in the Belk Bowl. In the season, Chris Jones would finish with 44 tackles on the season, 16 more than the previous year, 7.5 tackles for loss, and 2.5 sacks. After his 3 seasons at Mississippi State, he established himself as one of the best defensive prospects in the draft. He was taken with the 37th overall in the 2016 NFL Draft. 2016 draft was the draft that was headlined by, of course, just looking at the elite players that were taken before him. Joey Bosa was taken by the Chargers with the 3rd pick in that draft. Ezekiel Elliott, the elite running back for the Cowboys, was taken with the 4th pick. Jalen Ramsey, the elite corner for the now Los Angeles Rams, or Jalen Ramsey right now he was taken with the 5th overall pick. I'm just looking at players that were taken over him in his own position. Kenny Clark was taken by the Green Bay Packers out of UCLA. Robert Nkemdiche out of Ole Miss was taken by the Arizona Cardinals. Vernon Butler out of Louisiana Tech was taken by Carolina. And then the very next pick was Chris Jones. Out of all those, he was the 2nd highest drafted defensive tackle that was eventually named a Pro Bowler, just to give a little bit of context about that draft class. And following his 3 years in Mississippi, he would go on to play his NFL career at Kansas City. This has been a 5-year career thus far. In his very first season in 2016, in his age 22 season, he would start 11 of the 16 games he would play in a season where Kansas City would finish with a 12-4 record. They finished with the best record in the AFC West. This is the first year of the streak in which they have won the AFC West for the last 5 years. It was Chris Jones' first season. In that 2016 season, Chris Jones would finish with a combined 28 tackles on the season, 5 tackles for loss, and 2 sacks, as he was starting to separate himself from the pack and try to assert himself as a regular rotation player. Following his 2016 season, he would come back to Kansas City for his 2nd season, and this time he would come back as a defensive end. In 2017, he would start 7 of the 16 games that he would play in a season where the Kansas City Chiefs won the AFC West for the 2nd year in a row. They had a 10-16 record. They won 2 less games than the previous season, and this was when Patrick Mahomes officially took over by the end of the season as the starting quarterback for the Chiefs. In the season, he would go on to finish with he finished with 32 total tackles on the season, 4 more than his rookie year. He finished with 6.5 sacks at defensive end, which is 4.5 more than he did the previous year, 5 tackles for loss. He would go on to force 4 fumbles, which is the most fumbles he'd ever force in a season, along with defending 7 passes. He would also finish with an interception as well, as he was starting to become a more all-around player that Kansas City could see themselves relying on. This would transition into 2018, where he would go on to start 11 of the 16 games that he would play for a Kansas City Chiefs team that would go on to win the AFC West for the 3rd year in a row. The previous 2 years, they had lost in the first round of the playoffs. In Chris Jones' rookie year, they lost to the Steelers by 2. In his second year, they lost to the Titans by 1 in the wild card round. In 2018, like I said, after winning, they would go on to win the AFC West for the 3rd year in a row after Jones started 11 of the 16 games he would play. He would finish with 40 combined tackles on the season, which is the most tackles that he'd ever have. This would also be his last season at defensive end. In his last season at defensive end, he would also finish with 15.5 sacks, the most sacks he's ever put up in a career this season, and thus far the only time he has ever finished with more than 10 sacks on a season. He finished with 19 tackles for loss, which is also the set of the most amount of tackles for losses he's ever put up in a season. He also finished with a 20-yard pick 6, along with 2 fumble recoveries as well. At the conclusion of the 2018 season, Chris Jones was named to the second team All-Pro before he was actually named a Pro Bowler. And following the 2018 season, after Chris Jones would establish himself as one of the best defensive linemen in all of football, the Chiefs would end up winning their first playoff game since Chris Jones had been there after they beat the Colts 31-13 after Patrick Mahomes won the MVP and the Offensive Player of the Year. And then they would end up losing in overtime to the Patriots by 6 when the Patriots won the overtime kickoff, and then they would actually score to advance them to the Super Bowl, where they would go on to beat the LA Rams, just for a little bit of context. Following the season in which the Chiefs were knocking at the door of the Super Bowl, Chris Jones would come back for his 4th season with Kansas City in 2019, his age 25 season. He would start 12 of the 13 games that he would play as he became more of a regular starter, and he was kind of dealing with more injuries. This season, the Chiefs would finish with a 12-4 record, the same record that they finished with the previous season, as they, like I said, this would be the 4th straight year that they won the AFC West. In the regular season, Chris Davis would go on to become a Pro Bowler for the very first time in his career after finishing with 36 tackles and 9 sacks after getting moved to the defensive tackle position. He would go on to force a fumble and recover a fumble as well, not to mention the fact that he also finished with 8 tackles for losses. Once after he was named a Pro Bowler for the first time with Kansas City, they would go on to beat the Texans in the playoffs by 20 after they were trailing at one point. They would go on to beat the Titans in the AFC Championship following one of Derrick Henry's best seasons ever. And then they would go on to beat the San Francisco 49ers 31-20 in Super Bowl 54 after they were trailing in the 4th quarter. And of course, Chris Jones was a very big part of that. This is the year that Patrick Mahomes would go on to win his first Super Bowl MVP, and Andy Reid would win his very first Super Bowl as a head coach. And following his very first Pro Bowl season, Chris Jones would come back for his age 26 season in 2020, a season that was impacted by COVID to the point where there were no fans in the section, but they were still allowed to play a whole 16-game season. In the 2020 season, Chris Jones would start 14 of the 15 games he would play for a Kansas City Chiefs team that finished with a 14-2 record. This would go on to be the best record that the Kansas City Chiefs have actually ever put up in a season, or at least the most wins that they've ever been able to put up, as they won the AFC West for the 5th time in a row. In 2020, he would start 14 of the 15 games in a Pro Bowl season, in a season where he would make the Pro Bowl for the 2nd year in a row. He would finish with 36 combined tackles on the season, as well as 7.5 sacks, while also recovering 2 fumbles, and while also being named to the Pro Bowl for the 2nd year in a row. He was named to the 2nd team All-Pro for the 2nd time in the last 3 years. Once as a defensive end and once as a defensive tackle. Once the Kansas City Chiefs made the playoffs this year, they would end up beating the Browns by 5 in the first round. They would end up beating the Buffalo Bills in the AFC Championship by 2 touchdowns, and then they would end up losing to the Buccaneers in the Super Bowl 31-9, just to give a sense of how the Kansas City Chiefs have been playing out, and that is where Chris Jones currently stands as a defensive tackle right now. He is currently a two-time Pro Bowler, a player that's made the all-defensive second team twice, and he's also a Super Bowl champion. Not to mention that he's coming off of 2 straight Pro Bowl seasons, and it's very likely that the next season he could carry that momentum into the next year. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see what he does with this up-and-coming season. I think that this is a player that's very well entering the prime of his career, and considering he's turning 27 today, I can't wait to see what the future holds for him. Once again, I want to thank everyone for listening to all 11 minutes of this piece. Today is Saturday, July 3rd, 2021. And once again, I want to wish Chris Jones a happy 27th birthday. If you ever get a chance to watch him, he's wearing number 95 for the Chiefs. And even though the Chiefs are a team that's most definitely known for their potent, high-scoring offense, you have to know that their defense is also one of the reasons that they've been able to dominate their division the last 5 years. And Chris Jones is one of the players on the defensive line that has been that constant the entire time. And ever since he's been there, people have not been able to figure out the Chiefs' defense as well as their offense. Thanks once again for listening to my piece. I hope all is well, and I will come back tomorrow on July 4th with another episode of The Elite. Until then, peace out, and I'll catch you tomorrow.